All right. Cool CSS. So I wrote this post today. Been kind of kicking around this idea of writing a post about, I guess I'll go to the self view before we get into it. Been kicking around this idea about writing a post about kind of how I do CSS, which isn't, wholly unique. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different methodologies. But it's been working for me, and I feel like people who I talk to about it find it interesting. So I thought I'd share it. So yeah, let's take a look at this post real quick. If you haven't had a chance to read it, essentially, it kind of sums it up here in the first paragraph. Like, in the last year, I left Groupon and I started a new job at a startup called Provi, where I'm essentially creating a design system, building a CSS framework there to support the design system. And so it was basically like starting this new CSS framework from scratch. And I had built 3 of these frameworks back at Groupon. There was a lot of, I didn't just like copy and paste the Groupon framework and bring it over to Provi. I had to kind of solve different problems at Provi. And obviously there were different constraints, different, product features that I had to support, so I felt it was best to just start from scratch. But certainly I was able to bring over a lot of stuff, a lot of ideas from those Groupon frameworks, having built different ones there and learning new things from each of the previous one based on kind of the pain points that we had from those. The biggest one I describe in this article is the need for developers to write additional CSS on top of the framework to support new features. So coming into Provi, I wanted to make something where, basically if I'm doing my job well, no one should have to write CSS, which comes as a relief to a lot of developers. I was kind of surprised, in fact, going from being like the web guy at various companies to going to Groupon, how few developers either enjoyed or were proficient at CSS. And as time went on, the people who were proficient at CSS left the company, and because Groupon didn't particularly focus on that skill during interviews, we ended up with a lot of people who were not strong with CSS. And so when you don't have people with a certain skill set, it makes it hard to vet other people for that skill set, and it kind of the problem kind of perpetuates itself, right? And so I was able to find a niche at Groupon in developing these CSS frameworks that helped alleviate the struggle that a lot of developers have with CSS. And it kind of, it's a struggle across the board, right? Designers, it takes some more time because they spend a lot of time going back and forth with developers about, essentially making the picture of the website, making the website look like the picture that they made, right? And the developers are doing the best they can under the constraints, right? But it almost never ends up looking like the picture, at least not on the first try. So with these frameworks, the idea was kind of to enable the designers to abstract those design components into a CSS framework, basically like Twitter Bootstrap, but that was customized for our products at Groupon. And so that worked out pretty well, but we would still find that we needed to write new styles for new features as they came out, right? So, here's kind of a list of things that I wanted these frameworks to be. I wanted to be lightweight. Stack agnostic is key because every 2 years at least, there's some new hot stack that people are chasing, whether it's, just a Groupon. We went from a Rails app to like Angular to Node to, to React to Preact. That was just in like 8 years, right? And now, Jamstack is a big thing. At Provi, I came in just as we're transitioning from Angular to Svelte. And so I didn't want these frameworks to be tied into the tech stack. I just wanted it to be, you just pull in the CSS, add your classes to whatever, whatever backend language you're using, and you're good to go, right? I want these to be easy to use, so a lot of similarities to popular frameworks and naming conventions, but kind of customized for our own use. Easy to maintain, since I'm the only person maintaining these. I want it to be, there's this kind of, one of the things I ran into with Groupon is like, because of the way I was writing CSS, and I think just the nature of how people thought about CSS back in kind of the, when like BEM as a methodology was very popular, was like, okay, if I'm making a new feature that's a card, I need this card to be, I have to kind of encapsulate it so that I have the card styles and then the image that's in the card and then the headline in the card and the description in the card and the price in the card and the button in the card, and all this is scoped to the card so that the card can live wherever, right? But the more I thought about this and the more I ran into trouble, because if you're one person maintaining a CSS framework, what you don't want to have to do is basically be the keeper of what the entire product looks like. So anytime there's a new feature, you don't want to have to add a snapshot of that feature at the time it's built into the framework, because what happens is over time those features evolve and it makes it really difficult to keep the framework in sync with what the product is. And a lot of times developers will, because they're on a schedule, they will overwrite styles of the framework or add additional styles to support these new feature requests, and that doesn't always get communicated and put back into the system. So I wanted this to be super, in terms of like atomic design, like just draw the line at atoms and maybe a few molecules. But once you get into organisms, now you're in product territory, right? You're talking about like your homepage navigation, where you've got like your, you might have in there like a user menu that has a bunch of options in there, and you might have your navigation that has like a subnav with all your kind of verticals and things like that. And because those are, each of those parts of the site could potentially be its own team and all evolving independently, like you don't want the system or the design system or the framework to be like the gatekeeper of what that looks like, because it's not sustainable. So you want it to be themable, right? Because not only am I doing this Provi framework, but so I've got I started all these side projects. So I've got 11D recipes, right? I've got Dogs of Dev, which is another one I recently did. And as I'm building these sites, I find myself rewriting basically the same framework, just scoping it to a different website. But all this is essentially using the same CSS framework. I mean, this isn't super impressive because it's super basic. I really wanted the content to be the focus, and then build the site up using the recipes. And I just kind of haven't really put a ton of effort into this design-wise. But like this, for example, this is using the same framework that I'm using at Provi. It's just got a different theme, essentially, right? Different color palette, different type styles. But I mean, essentially, it's using a lot of the same patterns, right? And, this isn't a super complex site, but like if I run this through CSS Stats, it's not a lot of CSS, right? It's 7K of CSS. And if you look at even like Tachyons, is 72K. I just pulled semantic UI out of Provi's code base because it was not being used. We had 900K of CSS and 600 of that was semantic UI. And so by comparison, currently Provi's CSS framework is about 70K as well. A little bit less than that. But like it's not a lot of CSS is the point. And so by keeping it atomic, like we're keeping that file size low, and we're making it so that we can essentially create any component or any feature by combining these things. So how does that work in cool CSS? Let's look at some code here. Got my little talking points here. Cool CSS post, side projects. Right, so this actually is its own site, cool css.dev, if you want to check that out. It's basically the same post, but I have like this kitchen sink where I just kind of have all the different, kind of base atomic, element stuff styled, just to make sure that I had all that stuff. These forms are based on Stephanie Eccles has this great course that she just released on Egghead about styling accessible form fields, which I'd highly recommend. So I'm gonna base these on that. But as I build out cool CSS, I'll be adding stuff like modals and stuff that I have. But like here's like Fizz, for example, which is Provi's CSS framework. If you compare this to something like Tailwind, right, which is pure utility framework, like to make one of these buttons, you would have to specify like the border radius and the font color and the background color and all these things, right? Whereas in Cool, you're essentially just you're scoping all of those visual styles to one class, and you might have variants like button primary, button secondary. We have this super primary that's literally like used like in one place, and we just called it that as a joke. But like, it's pretty easy. If I want a button, I just put Fizz button, right? And so with Cool, essentially, if I look at the, it's driven by these tokens, which are kind of the way we theme this stuff. Let's see. Let me widen this a little bit. So I have this prefix token called cool, and then basically in every other thing, I can scope all of the styles. This is called cool CSS, but if I started a new project, if I went to work at, Nike, I could change the prefix to Nike, and everything would be scoped under, .Nike styles, for example. So literally everything in the framework is scoped at least under, so I would add, in this case, cool styles to the body, right? So that any of these kind of reset elements within a cool styles class gets affected. Because one of the things I found at Provi is like when you're introducing a CSS framework to an existing code base, you can't just like say, hey, I'm gonna rewrite what the base styles of an A element without scoping that. Otherwise, you just break a bunch of existing shit. So we had to scope all of that stuff to this class called Fizz styles, just to avoid breaking things while we kind of integrate it, with our existing code base, and so we have to like kind of go back and refactor things to pull stuff out. So going back to this, for example, so this is basically saying like, okay, I have just some kind of, if it's in cool styles, we have some styles for, basic stuff, so that I don't have to, do like cool fig caption and cool table, right? I mean, I do have a cool table class called cool table, but this will work even if you just use a table, a plain table within cool CSS. But then like kind of deeper in here, if I get into like, cool tables, for example, so here again, I have the prefix. So like cool table has these styles, and then a th within a t head within a cool table. This is like a responsive table, right? So here's the kitchen sink, here's the table, right? So this is kind of built mobile first, so that on a handheld device, it kind of uses data attributes to label each row or each cell of each row, and then there's a media query that basically hides that on larger screens. But really the idea is like all the visual styles of a component, which is really like any of these single things, is just its own thing, right? And it might have some variance, but I don't have to, like Tailwind, I don't have to specify all of the different visual properties of a component. And certainly if you're just making a reusable component, that's pretty easy to do. But then in your markup, you've got, your button has like 10 classes on it to describe what it looks like, when you could just have one and put that in your CSS, right? And when you're using a design system, kind of what you don't want is to give people that power to use any combination of visual styles on any component. You want to you want to maintain, like, this is what our primary button looks like, and we don't deviate from that. And we might have some variants of that, like maybe like if we look at buttons in Fizz, we might have this kind of plain button, and then this is our call to action, and maybe this is some kind of like secondary button, and disregard this ridiculous button. Or we might have like an icon in there, or like a text button, right? And so we don't want, like, maybe we don't have a green button and we don't want people making a green button. And so, that's where I think utility first kind of bites you in the ass. And maybe, if it works for you, great. But so then how do we handle larger components, right? Like if I wanted to make a card, how would I do that? Or let's look at something that's like, let's see, do I have anything in here that's like somewhat complex? A lot of this is super basic stuff. Here, I'll just kind of go through this, like alerts. This is just an alert with some content in it, and this content can be whatever, right? It's just the alert is basically just describing what is the border, and then the modifier is saying what color is it, what color is the border, the background, and which icon is it using. And these icons are embedded in there in it's like a URL encoded SVG background. But like all this stuff, we're just using, this is saying the badge icon styles is describing pretty much the whole thing. And then we're applying a color using one of these utilities. So that's where the kind of component, cool, if I didn't mention it earlier, component, utility, layout, right? So we're kind of building from the inside out. We build the components, describe everything, how they look like. The utilities allow us to modify those components and also describe how they're laid out, right? So I'll show you an example here in the utility classes. So we have like FlexBox utilities, right? So a lot of times you'll have a component where you're repeating a thing and you want to lay it out horizontally. So we have this Fizz flex row that basically just applies FlexBox to it and aligns everything, centers it vertically, right? So that they all line up. And this is something that like if you're using BEM, you would put that on like 20 different components, right? Like display flex, align item center, right? And so the way cool works is like you can just apply this to whatever, right? Like I don't need to make a button group that does this. I don't have to make a class called button group that all it does is apply flex row, but it's like specific to this context. I can just make some buttons and pop it in a flex row like this, right? Fizz flex row. This is a list. Doesn't have to be a list, but in this case, it's a flex row where each list item is a Fizz button, right? And that's it. I don't have to say this is a button row. I don't have to be that specific about the context in which it's used, because I can also turn around and on breadcrumbs, this is also using a flex row, right? But I can bake that into breadcrumbs because that's a very specific pattern. And I don't have to say like, this is, breadcrumbs link, breadcrumbs list item, right? I don't have to get that specific about the CSS. I can just scope it all under Fizz breadcrumbs. What else? So like here's kind of an example, right? We have like this option list item. This is a very like specific style. But it's just like this could be anything in here, right? This is the list item is just saying, or item list is just saying like each item in here has this style with an arrow, but this content could be whatever, right? This doesn't have to be bold. It doesn't have to be 2 lines. And we're not describing we're not saying anything about the content, right? But like you could really build a lot of these using Fizz utility classes. Like there's utilities that add borders and radiuses and things like that. But kind of the big thing, so let me go back to these FlexBox utilities, right? So pretty much anything you could do in FlexBox, we have like a class for it, right? So so inline, this is kind of like a block, just a regular flex, display flex, and this is display flex, inline flex, right? And this kind of illustrates the difference. You can add numbers onto the end. The default spacing between a flex row item is 16 pixels, but you can override that. And these are all spacing values from our design system. So we have kind of this spacing scale that goes like 4, 8, 16, 24, 32. So you can, so we don't have people just like using arbitrary values. Like the designers aren't using arbitrary values and the developers aren't using arbitrary values. So we're very intentional about our spacing, right? And so what Cool allows you to do is basically in the tokens, here's our spacing values. I could change the scale to whatever, right? If I wanted that to be a different scale. But I find for me personally, like I'm using the same scale on every project, right? It's pretty common values, and it looks good across, across different themes, right? Like really your theme is like your color palette and your type scale and your font. That's like 90% of what differentiates one project from another. And then kind of like how you compose the components within that. And so, basically when we're like composing stuff, it's just like positioning stuff with Flexbox or Grid. And, this kind of shows you a lot of different examples of things you can do. And so this could be anything. It doesn't have to be buttons. It could be text. It could be, larger components. But this helps you kind of arrange them in relation to other components, right? So those are utilities. And we have spacing utilities, right? Like I can apply bottom margins using Fizz stack, or I can do add right margin using inline classes. And then Andy Bell has this idea of flow where I could just say, okay, if I want all of the paragraphs in an article to have 16 pixels of bottom margin, I don't have to apply Fizz stack 16 to every paragraph. I can just put Fizz flow 16 on the article, and then every child of the article, whether it's a paragraph or whatever else, will have that bottom margin applied to it. And then it basically just looks like this, right? Fizz flow 16. So that means all of these have 16 pixels of bottom margin except for the last one. Fizz surface is just like, this is a white card essentially on top of the gray body. And then Fizz inset square is like how we apply padding within the element, right? So that I kind of described that down here. And this is like all these naming conventions come from Nathan Curtis has an article on Medium. I think it's just called Space and Design Systems. Here it is. Yep. So I refer to this article a lot, and I think Nathan said that he's evolved beyond this. This is from 2016, but I still use it. But he kind of describes, it's a great kind of vocabulary for describing space, particularly in communicating those values between designers and developers, and across platforms, right? Because on native platforms, like they don't really talk about margins and padding. It's more kind of like, coordinate systems and stuff like that, as far as I know. But he talks about spacing scales, which I kind of showed here, which I use something somewhat similar. But yeah, this is was highly informative to how I do this. So squish is like more spacing on the sides than on the top, and then stretch is the opposite. And then width, the idea of cool CSS is like, we don't need the 12 column grid, because 12 column grid is kind of in the same vein of Tailwind, as it allows you to do whatever. It allows anyone on any project to do whatever, right? And we don't want to do that. We want to do very specific things. But usually, even though we have this 12 column grid, I'm just saying, like, I want to split this in half, right? Or I want to show 3 cards per row. We're not saying I want this to be 3/12 and I want this to be 5/12, and we're not, as I said in my article, like, we're not Swiss modernists, right? like we're not trying to make a museum poster in 1950 or whatever. We're making websites, so typically, like, this is all you need, right? And that brings me to layout, which I haven't written up docs for that in Fizz yet, or on Cool CSS, obviously. But the idea with layouts, if we look at something like this, like, I mean, let's talk about this, right? You might have heard of the Holy Grail, I can't spell, Holy Grail layout, right? This is the dumbest thing, but I mean, just look at the Google images for it. This is an idea that has been around since I've been making websites since, before CSS existed. And this is the Holy Grail layout, right? You got a header, a footer, a left panel, a right panel, and a main body. And it used to be we had to do this using tables, and then we were able to do it with floats, and now we have FlexBox and Grid that makes this really easy. But if you look at literally any website, this website, for example, this doesn't have a left or right panel. It's just header, main, and probably a footer. Here's their, I don't know, this is probably where their footer starts, somewhere in here, right? But, like, this is a layout, right? I don't need a 12 column grid to make this page. It's just 3 things stacked on top of each other, right? And I can write that pretty easily. But maybe it gets trickier. On Cool CSS, for example, I don't have a lot of content here, or I guess Fizz is a better example. I've got this kind of left rail here where I have my navigation. I've got my header. I don't think I really have I do have a small footer here. I need to update that. But yeah, this is like a layout, right? So I don't need a 12 column grid to make this. I can just make a CSS grid layout. So here's an example, right? I have this layout called 2 column aside main, which I use on Cool CSS, but it's actually main aside. But whatever, it's the naming is consistent within itself, even if semantically it's not doing that. But essentially, this is just a grid layout, and we have these name template areas where we're saying on mobile, It's just header, main, the aside goes at the bottom. You could switch those if we wanted to. And then the footer goes at the bottom. And then rather than use classes to style these, I use data attributes to apply. So I have this data attribute called grid area, where I basically specify the grid area name that lays out the page here, because while you might use this for a top level page layout, right, that has your actual semantic header, main, footer, maybe you're making a modal and you want to use that same layout with like a little sidebar and a main area and a header and footer, right? So you could just as easily use this layout. You could reuse this layout inside of a modal by applying this to the modal container, and then having these divs that aren't maybe necessarily element wise, it's not using the header element, but it's a div with a data grid area of header, and it accomplishes the same thing. And so like here in the article, I'm just like applying a max width in here. So this is controlling like the container of the page, right? And then within a page, I have stuff either described, classed, all the visual styles of a heading are scoped to, this heading class. And then the distance between these two headings are done using utility classes, where in this case, I think I'm just using the flow utility on the article that gives every child element a margin. But if I wanted to override that with like a stack class, I could do that as well. And then if there was a case where I wanted to get a little more complicated and lay stuff out within the article, I could apply different utility classes to do that as well. But the idea is like, if I'm making something more complex, I don't have to write styles for that. I can just use a combination of the core elements, the core element styles, and then use the utilities to kind of compose them. And then that goes inside of a layout, right? So we're building from the inside out, and we're not, this makes it so that like anytime we have a new feature, 9 times out of 10, we can do it with these kind of core things. It's just a matter of like marking it up correctly. So, it can end up looking kind of like Tailwind, but then you don't have to use like purge CSS to take out like every little thing every little style declaration that you're not using, right? I mean, Fizz in its current state is maybe like 65K, which is not bad considering that our entire app currently is at about 350, including Fizz. And my current project is basically refactoring the app to use Fizz instead of whatever existing styles we have. So that's kind of where I'm going with Cool CSS. This is kind of, Fizz is kind of like a real world case. I can't really show you like the Pro V app, but needless to say, we've built entire, massive features with this. We have like a thing that allows people to make their own kind of storefront page, and it's pretty complex, and we can do that just by using this like really basic stuff, right? Let me go back to my talking points here. Code walkthrough. Just talked about that a little bit. Cool CSS and Fizz. Using Fizz and CodePen. Okay, so one of the things I like to do, I have a URL shortener at Pro-V called pro.vi, and I have a redirect that goes to CodePen. So I can just type in Pro-V/CodePen, and that opens a new pen that already is pulling in Fizz, and then I can just start building stuff in Fizz. So I have no idea what I would even build, but I can kind of go into my work here. Go ahead and leave this page. Okay, so like here's an example. This is super basic, but like I don't even think I really did a whole lot of Fizz styles, but so you could imagine this is like a common thing you might see in an app, right? And one of the developers was struggling to kind of like get this to look like the picture, so I was like, I'll just go to prov/CodePen, and it's pulling in Fizz styles, and I can build it there. And so in like less than 5 minutes, I made this Fizz surface red. That's just saying give me a card that's got a red background. Fizz inset squish 16. That means 8 pixels of top and bottom padding and 16 on the sides. Fizz flow 8. Every child of this container should have 8 pixels of bottom margin. And then Fizz radius medium just applies a border radius to the card. And then we want this first text to be red, so Fizz text urgent, and then everything else is just HTML, right? So I don't have to come up with a name for what this card is. And this is like a failed payment card, and now I have to have failed payment title and failed payment item and all of this shit like in my styles, because all of that stuff already exists with these other classes, right? And then the other benefit of this is like, okay, if I can't make this card with what's already in Fizz, and I have to add this Fizz surface red, then I can go in and add this to the actual framework and push a commit so that they can bump the version of Fizz that they're using and get those styles to get this card. So basically all he has to do is like copy and paste this into his his environment and then wire it up, right? And just say, this is probably like he's got something in here like, okay, there's this payment submitted, and he's probably just got some templating thing in here that's like, template payments.date, right? Or something like that. But yeah, I mean, and it's like very little effort. So this is kind of like the approach of cool CSS, right? Is that all of the, we're using utilities, but more to describe the relationship between atomic components and not describing the components themselves. And if we are, then we can do that. We can still do that. But like, I don't have to go full on BEM and come up with a name for what this is called, right? Because some other dev on some other team might be making a blue one of these, right? That's got completely different content. And maybe I don't want to keep track of that in the design system. I don't have the bandwidth to like, and then add additional code to support a blue version of this, right? I could just go in here and change this to surface blue, right? And now it's blue. But also, like, I don't have a surface class for every single color in our color palette, right? So here's our color palette. I'm not gonna, because of like accessibility concerns, we don't want to just let people use any combination of these colors in any context. We have very specific background colors, basically the way these color numbers work, and we went a little overboard with these shades. We don't really even use this many shades, but essentially like anything 100 is accessible on any other colors. 600 foreground on 100 background or white background is accessible. And so it makes it so we don't even have to really think about whether something's accessible. We're just saying that text has to be at least 600, right, to be accessible on white or 100. And stuff in between has very specific use cases that are limited, right? Like things like borders on form elements or stuff like that. But yeah, so let's see if there's any other interesting ones here that I could share that are like super proprietary. Here's my dog that I did for an animation workshop. Table menu. Here's an interesting one. So we already had these tables, and we had this issue where like we wanted to have this little kind of like pop over menu in here. And so like these table styles are already handled in Fizz. Just Fizz table, and then highlight rows is another class that gives you this functionality. But everything else is just, you just mark it up like a table, right? Like I don't have to add a bunch of classes in here to describe the thing. I have these data labels in here so that responsively it has these, it labels each cell of each row, like we talked about earlier. But then here for this, we created this new Fizz component called Fizz table menu, which essentially just styles the button, and then you have the popover itself, which, this content could be whatever. So we just applied this utility called Fizz no wrap to prevent, this from being like option and then one appearing below it. Because, in practice, this isn't going to say option one, right? It's going to be some other long thing. But yeah, like I was able to pair with the developer, and we just kind of, knocked this out over the course of like 30 minutes or an hour. And then when we had to like make the actual styles for this table menu, we did it in CodePen. And then I basically essentially just created a new SAS file in Fizz and then copied and pasted this over, and then pushed the change, and she was able to use this in production. So yeah, it's the developers love it because it's super simple. It keeps the markup pretty tidy. I mean, aside from occasionally having multiple classes, they're not finding the need to like nest divs or like apply classes to every single element. The designers love it because this looks just like the picture. Like if I dug up the Figma for this feature, it's pixel perfect. It's using all the same spacing values because we already built the table styles. It's using the correct color palette, colors. This color combination is accessible. So all that stuff's just kind of baked in, right? And we're using a very little CSS, using the bare minimum of markup. And if I had, if I'm doing something for one of my side projects and I need a table, I can just use cool CSS and essentially use this, cool table menu, or like I have dogs of dev. And all the classes in here are, DOD, right? So space between responsive is a class in Fizz as well. And it's basically just says like, space between, right? You have these two items, space them as far apart as possible. And then on mobile, because this has the responsive thing, on mobile, it will stack them, right? If I don't include the responsive, it will maintain that space between while you're still on mobile, right? So I'm using basically the same styles as Fizz in a limited set of those styles, but like within, so here's cool CSS, right? I'm importing all of these different files that do different things, but like maybe let's say I'm using cool CSS to make dogs of dev, right? The first thing I would do is I'd go into tokens, and I would change this prefix from cool to DOD, right? And so now all of my styles will be prefixed with DOD, so that's specific to this project. And then I might go in here and change the color palette. Maybe I don't need red, right? I'll blow this out. I'll update the blues. And then in cool CSS, like, okay, I don't need tables, I can just delete that, right? The utilities and the maybe I don't need these layouts because I'm, or I might add a layout. And then so SAS is just kind of like compiling this and saying, you know, pull in all this stuff and then compile this to CSS, to cool CSS, right? And so then you've got your, you know, this, the entire cool is like 500 lines of CSS currently, and that's, oh, there's a lot of like line breaks in here, so it's not even that much. So it's really not a lot. Obviously I have a lot of stuff that I still need to add to this to make it more useful across different projects, but I mean, largely, like, all I'm doing is, like, you know, applying text styles, right? I have in my tokens, I've got my color palette, I've got my font size and line height pairing for all my different headings, and you know, really, I find in most projects I don't need more than 4 headings. I don't need more than 3 like body text sizes, and you know, I might change the scale, but I don't really need to add like a extra large text, extra large, right? I try and just keep it simple. I can change this font family, you know, from Rubik to I don't remember what this font was, but it's fun. I like it. I can change the weights. So these are, you know, the way I approach tokens is I have these global tokens which describe all the values in the system, and then I have what I call contextual tokens, which is like how those different tokens are used in different contexts. So text colors, right? We might have, you know, we want to specify that the body color is this, and maybe we have a more subdued color, which is a gray 600. Interactive, which is like used for links, is blue 600, and then the hover state is blue 800. We have a error color and an inverse, right? So kind of what this allows us to do is, you know, make sure that people aren't using color combinations in ways that the design system didn't intend. So we know going in that all of these combinations are accessible. And so when we're writing the styles, if I'm making a link, I'm not saying that the link color is blue 600. I'm saying the color is text interactive. Because if I end up changing what this color is, maybe I want our, you know, we're doing a rebrand, and now the interactive color, you know, our links are green, right? So I want to use green, you know, 600. Or maybe they're like, hey, darken this up, you know, darken up blue 600, and I have to go in here and change like the hex value or something. Or maybe bump this from blue 600 to blue 700. Who knows, right? But essentially, like, this is like another layer of abstraction, but that kind of lets us change multiple components, visual styles in one place, right? So anywhere we're using, we'll say, like a button is a great example. So we might have like, I don't have a ton of examples in here yet. But like, let's say we wanted to change our, any context where our brand background is being used. So maybe that's our header, maybe that's our call to action button, right? We could change that in one place here instead of going into the CSS and finding everywhere the brand is used and changing that from color blue 800 to like color green 800, or, you know, some completely new color. We can just apply that here. And then there's component tokens, right? Which is like a very specific, this is the values of a single component, in this case a form field, like a text input. So I can come up with, like, you know, I can point this to global tokens like spacing values. Maybe the form field has a background color and I'm using a contextual token to control that, like background disabled, for example. And so I have these kind of 3 levels of tokens that allow me to have like increasingly finer control over how I apply these visual styles. So really, like, at the end of the day, all of these things should have very few, like, I have yet to go back in here and change stuff like this, but like this would be font weight semi-bold, right? Stuff like, display block, you don't really need to tokenize that kind of stuff. But anything that's like, font weight, this is normal, right? That's 400. Again, here's another font weight semi-bold. So basically I'm going in here and I'm just like updating all of this stuff to use tokens, right? So ultimately, like, my CSS is going to look like this. This probably needs to be a token. But then if I'm using cool CSS on a new project, I can essentially like override everything strictly via the tokens. I don't have to go into any of these individual SAS files. If I want to change the color palette, I can do that here. If I want to change contextually how those colors are used, I can do that here. If I want to change the colors of form fields, maybe the border, form control border, I can do that here. Yeah, so for any project, I'm basically just editing this prefix so I can, use it differently on a different project, and then all of the visual styles. But like, I shouldn't have to like restyle what a button, a button is. Every button on every website has a border radius, whether that's 0 or some value, right? It has potentially a border. It has a font family, font size, line height, maybe some padding in here, maybe a minimum width value, a minimum height value potentially. Maybe it's got a box shadow on it, right? And maybe it doesn't have all of those things, and we can adjust those in the tokens to just be 0 or whatever. But we don't have to like redefine what a button looks like for every project, for every feature, for every company you work at, right? You can just hit that. So the idea of this, of cool CSS for me, was like kind of Lord of the Rings style, like one framework to rule them all, right? Like, I don't want to just keep redoing the same framework all the time. And I'm sure in a year it's going to be some different thing. But that's the beauty, right? Let's say I've got all these side projects. I've got my work design system. I've got, the cool website itself. I've got Dogs of Dev, and some new fucking cool CSS thing comes out, right? Instead of having to go in and like into all these different sites and update that on all these different sites, I can just go into cool CSS and build it out in there, and then basically bump the version of cool CSS that these are using. And so the tokens generally won't be different, but maybe for navigation I'm using some newfangled CSS thing that's not even out yet, and I've updated how that works so that it's it's better in some way. But I can basically do that across projects in one place and not have to do that a bunch of times. So really, like, this was less like, the framework itself is more for me personally. If other people get use out of it, great. If not a big deal. No one needs another CSS framework. Like, literally no one needs it. But the methodology, I think, is sound. It's a nice compromise. Like, it's not as verbose as BEM, and it's a little stricter. It's really like, it's a little stricter than something like Tailwind, which lets you just do whatever. And it's like a nice balance, right? So yeah, that's my pitch for cool CSS. According to my thing, there's literally one person watching, and no one has said anything. So you could probably also be watching this on VOD, in which case, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I'm Peruvian Idol on Twitter. But yeah, I'm going to be working on this over the course of the next few months. I'll probably do some live streams of me working on cool CSS and building that out, and maybe building some projects with cool CSS. And if you make websites and you have a dog, go to dogsof.dev and click on submit a dog. And yeah, send me a picture of your dog and I'll slap him up here on Dogs of Dev. This site was born out of our turbulent times, all of our doom scrolling. I wanted a website where I could just look at dogs and not worry about, looking at sifting through memes and political stuff. I just look at all these cool dogs and, give them all virtual boops on the nose. Look at all these lovely dogs. But yeah, it's a fun little project. Took me like, a couple days to build. So yeah, that's cool CSS. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you later.